Tuesday evenings are supposed to be uneventful, dull, predictable, the kind of nights where the television murmurs in the background while you fold laundry you don't care about. But that evening felt hollow. The walls of the house seemed to echo with a quiet I hadn't invited. I had become familiar with silence since the day my wife walked out. Silence had become my dinner guest, my alarm clock, my unrequested roommate. She disappeared without an argument or an apology, leaving behind only scattered drawers, a half-used perfume bottle, and a wedding album she left open on the dining table as if she didn't need the memories anymore. I tried pretending life was normal. I continued going to work, attended meetings, smiled at colleagues, answered emails, but something inside me had cracked. Not because I missed her, but because I never understood why she left. She had stood in our living room months ago, suitcase in hand, saying she needed space, as though marriage was a suffocating corridor and I was the air she couldn't breathe. She didn't slam the door. She didn't cry. She just walked out calm, rehearsed, almost relieved. That was the last time I saw her. I deleted her photos, packed her clothes, stored her belongings, and convinced myself I was doing the adult thing: acceptance. I stopped checking my phone for messages. I stopped imagining dramatic reunions or heartfelt apologies. I forced my heart to adapt to a new condition: emptiness, without complaint. I wouldn't say I healed, but I built routines around the wound, the way one learns to walk with a limp. Then my phone vibrated. I didn't rush to it. Habits die slow. When I finally picked it up, I froze, not because of the message, but because of the sender. Her name lit the screen like a fire alarm in a dark hallway. I blinked, convinced my mind was hallucinating. Months of nothing, and suddenly her text appeared with the arrogance of someone certain she still had access to my life. "I'm ready to be your wife again. I'm coming home." My pulse thudded so loudly I felt it in my fingertips. There was no context, no apology, no explanation. She wrote as if marriage were a switch she could turn on and off whenever life bored her. The tone wasn't affectionate, it was entitled. That message carried years of assumptions, that my heart had been frozen in time waiting for her return, that I still considered her absence a temporary inconvenience, that she could abandon responsibilities and retrieve them like forgotten shoes. I reread the message once, twice, 5 times. Each reading made it stranger. Part of me felt like laughing, another part felt like smashing the phone. I didn't know whether it was manipulation, nostalgia, or a storm I didn't see coming. Rational people say closure is necessary, but closure is a luxury offered by those who never faced unanswered betrayal. My brain screamed to ignore her. My pride wanted to reply with insults. My soul, however, whispered something different. Not forgiveness, not desire, but curiosity. Curiosity is a dangerous counselor. I stared at the screen for several minutes, my thumb hovering, the house feeling suddenly smaller. Was this a test? A trap? Or the universe handing me a chance to finish a chapter properly? I typed one sentence, 7 words so simple they felt harmless. "The door will be open." I hit send. In that moment, I didn't fully understand what I had just done. I didn't know those 7 words would become the fuse that ignited the explosion she never anticipated. I didn't know they would unravel her confidence, dismantle her narrative, and expose truths I didn't even know existed. I believed I was opening a door. In reality, I was opening a battlefield. And she was already on her way. Later, much later, when the truth had no place left to hide, she admitted every mile of that drive felt like a victory lap she believed she deserved. She didn't just decide to come back. She prepared for a triumphant descent, the kind celebrities make before accepting applause. She sat behind the wheel of her white SUV, engine humming like an obedient servant, her reflection smug in the rear-view mirror. Her hair cascaded perfectly over her shoulders, her lipstick matched the soft blush she used at our wedding, and the perfume she sprayed before leaving the car was the same scent she once claimed was our story bottled. She didn't choose it accidentally. She wanted to weaponize nostalgia. She imagined the scene she was driving toward, me pacing nervously, desperate for her return, perhaps candles burning, maybe chocolates on the counter, apologies ready to pour out like confessions at a revival meeting. In her mind, she was the heroine returning from exile, the missing puzzle piece, the judge of my endurance. Every red light became a moment to practice her lines. She repeated them with a trembling voice she didn't actually feel, rehearsing a tear-filled speech that painted her as wounded, misunderstood, spiritually reborn. She wasn't returning because she loved me. She was returning because she believed I had no alternative but to welcome her. The city blurred past her windows. Restaurants we once visited flashed by like silent witnesses. The bakery where she once cried because they got her order wrong. The park bench where she pretended to contemplate life while scrolling through other people's vacations. The bridge where she once declared marriage was a journey, not a prison, right before leaving me incarcerated in questions she refused to answer. As she drove, she wasn't haunted by memories. She was intoxicated by them. She believed every street belonged to her history. That illusion gave her the confidence of someone who misinterprets absence as loyalty. She cracked the window slightly, letting the breeze lift her hair, imagining how I would react at the front door. She pictured the shock on my face, the tremor in my voice, the way my shoulders would drop in relief. The marriage she walked away from was, in her mind, paused, not ended. She believed men waited. She believed homes obeyed. She believed she could return whenever life outside disappointed her. As the house came into view, her heart didn't race because of fear. It raced because of pride. She imagined stepping out of the car like royalty returning to her palace after a temporary escape. She planned every detail, the soft knock, the dramatic pause, the first tear rolling down her cheek as she whispered, "I made a mistake." She even rehearsed sighs, preparing to appear fragile and transformed. She thought she was bringing closure, redemption, and a second chance wrapped in perfume and practiced regret. What she didn't know was that time had changed the terrain she abandoned. The curtains she once chose were gone. The subtle scent she used to leave behind had been replaced. The house she expected to reclaim had stopped orbiting around her absence. She had no clue decisions had been made without her counsel. She assumed the door she once slammed remained waiting for her touch. She drove like a conqueror returning to a land she believed she owned. She didn't check her messages for clarification. She didn't wonder why I replied so quickly. She didn't consider the possibility of consequence. Arrogance doesn't ask permission, it assumes invitation. As she turned into the driveway, she inhaled deeply, preparing for applause that never existed. The quiet street looked the same, but something beneath it had shifted. She gathered her things, adjusted her dress, and smiled at herself one last time in the mirror. She believed she was arriving at a reunion. She was actually arriving at her reckoning. The moment her hand touched the doorknob, she felt certainty pulsing through her veins. She expected familiarity to greet her, the smell of her favorite fabric softener, the gentle hum of the old refrigerator, the reflection of her choices frozen in time. She believed the house she abandoned would have waited like a loyal dog, curled beside the door, eager for her return. But the instant the door opened, confidence cracked. The scent was the first betrayal. Gone was the floral aroma she always insisted to find, good taste. In its place lingered something richer, subtle, intentional, like sandalwood blended with quiet mystery. Her eyes darted across the room, expecting the living space to mirror the memory imprinted in her ego. Instead, it resembled a life she didn't own. The beige curtains she had chosen after 3 arguments and 4 trips to the store had vanished. The embroidered tablecloth she ironed obsessively was nowhere to be seen. The couch she once claimed was the centerpiece of comfort had been replaced by a sleek, modern leather sofa she would have never approved of. Her heels clacked against the wooden floor, each step punctuating disbelief. The room was familiar enough to feel like a ghost of her past, yet foreign enough to announce she no longer belonged. The walls now held artwork she had never seen, abstract imagery, city skylines, and a portrait of a face she didn't recognize. She paused, confused. That house had once been a reflection of her personality, her preferences, her victories in every domestic debate. Now it reflected something else entirely: evolution. She took a slow breath, careful not to reveal panic even though no one was watching. She whispered my name, expecting it to float through the air and summon a response. The silence that followed felt thicker than any argument we had ever endured. It wasn't an angry silence. It was indifferent. And indifference is a language more brutal than hatred. Her heels continued tapping as she walked deeper into the living room. She spotted a new bookshelf, stacked with titles she couldn't connect to me. I had never been a collector of novels, yet here stood shelves lined with biographies, philosophy, and travel books, proof of a mind she had stopped exploring long before she walked out. She ran her fingers along the spines, as though touching them would reveal clues. Instead, every title whispered a truth she wasn't ready to accept. Someone had been growing while she was gone. She headed to the kitchen next, believing she would find at least one artifact of her reign. But the kitchen had transformed. The mismatched mugs she cherished for their quirkiness were replaced by elegant, uniform ceramics. The chaotic drawer, once overflowing with utensils she never returned properly, was now systematically arranged. There was no mess, no disorder, no trace of the woman who once dictated the rules of this home. She shut the drawer too quickly, rattling her composure. The refrigerator hummed softly. She opened it out of instinct. It was full, not with leftovers or abandoned condiments, but fresh produce, labeled containers, and meals planned with intent. This wasn't survival food. It was living. Her heartbeat quickened. She returned to the hallway and stared at the family picture that once showcased our smiles. It had been replaced by something she couldn't comprehend. An empty wall, smooth and unbothered.
No reminders.
No history. And then, the most jarring sight, a tall potted plant near the window. She once despised plants, insisting they brought insects and dirt. She stood before it, speechless. It thrived, green, hydrated, unapologetically present. A living metaphor she couldn't escape. She called my name again, louder this time. The house didn't echo. It swallowed her voice. The realization wasn't gradual. It landed like a verdict. Time hadn't paused. It had progressed. She hadn't come home. She had entered someone else's life. The first sound she heard wasn't my voice. It was the subtle click of a latch turning from the inside, slow, deliberate, as if the person behind it had nothing to fear. My wife stiffened, the weight of her expectations pressing against her ribs. She positioned her shoulders, prepared to meet a man she imagined would crumble the moment he saw her. She inhaled deeply, rehearsed her sadness, and readied herself for sympathy she believed she still deserved. The door swung open. Her confidence shattered in a single heartbeat. Standing before her was not the abandoned husband she expected, but a woman. A woman she didn't know, wearing my shirt with the ease of someone who had never been questioned about belonging. The sight was devastating not for its surprise, but for its clarity. Nothing about this woman looked temporary. She didn't clutch the fabric to cover herself, nor did she step back to justify her presence. She stood with relaxed posture, one hand on the doorframe, the other resting casually at her side, like someone who had nothing to prove. Her expression wasn't nervous. It was composed. She didn't blink rapidly, didn't offer excuses, didn't scramble for explanations. Her eyes held a calm depth, not defiant, not arrogant, simply certain. That certainty was the first blow. My wife had imagined she was returning to a house grieving her absence. Instead, she found a presence that didn't tremble in her shadow. My wife's lips parted, but no words came. The speech she practiced in the car evaporated. Her apology, her dramatic entrance, her attempt at reclaiming emotional ground, all of it died at the threshold. She tried to make sense of what she saw, but the truth stood right in front of her. This wasn't a visitor. This wasn't a mistake. This was replacement. The woman stepped back just enough to allow space, but not enough to surrender control. It was an invitation without permission, a gesture that communicated both politeness and ownership. It was as if she were saying, "You may enter, but understand you are entering my world, not returning to yours." My wife's gaze darted across the woman's appearance, searching frantically for something to discredit her. But she found no chaos, no insecurity, No sign of someone desperate to impress. The shirt she wore wasn't wrinkled. It was comfortably fitted, as though it had been hanging in her section of the closet. Her hair was neatly tied, her face natural, her posture still. Nothing about her looked borrowed. The silence between them thickened, carrying more truth than any confrontation could have delivered. My wife swallowed hard, her throat tightening around a realization she wasn't prepared to face. She had underestimated the passage of time. She believed the home she walked away from remained emotionally vacant, waiting for her signal to restart. She assumed she would still be the reference point, the axis of meaning. But the woman at the door represented something far more brutal than betrayal. She represented progress. My wife tried to regain footing. She straightened her back, attempted a polite smile, and forced out a strained, trembling question. Is he here? The woman didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. Her response wasn't cruel. It was factual, delivered with the calm authority of someone who didn't need validation. He'll be out in a moment. Just like that, my wife's illusion collapsed. She wasn't the center. She wasn't expected. She wasn't the storm. She was history. The house she believed she could reclaim had already rewritten its story. The role she abandoned had been filled without audition, without negotiation, without her approval. And as she stood there on the doorstep, struggling to hold together the fragments of her confidence, one truth settled into her chest. Cold, undeniable, irreversible. She didn't return home. She walked into someone else's life. Her breath trembled before her pride did. She stood in the doorway, frozen between the past she thought she could reclaim and the present she never imagined existed. Her eyes darted from the woman wearing my shirt to the hallway behind her, desperate for a familiar anchor. But nothing felt familiar anymore. Not the space, not the air, not the silence that refused to bow to her presence. She opened her mouth, attempting to speak, but her voice collided with something stronger than shock, irrelevance. For the first time in her life, she was the one intruding. That truth hovered in the room like perfume she hadn't chosen. Then she heard me, not from the doorway, not from the shadows, but from right behind her, close enough for her to feel the warmth of the breath she once believed she owned. You left a husband. Someone else found a partner. I didn't yell. I didn't curse. I didn't spit accusations like she once did. My tone was flat, measured, almost gentle. And yet, it landed like a verdict. She flinched, not because of volume, but because of accuracy. She had walked away assuming loyalty was a chain only one side could break. Now she stood before the consequences she never calculated. Slowly, she turned toward me. The shock in her eyes wasn't theatrical. It was raw, unfiltered confusion. I wasn't slumped or broken. My shoulders weren't drooped, my eyes weren't swollen, and my presence wasn't that of a man abandoned. I looked rested, composed, changed. And then came the moment she would later describe as the cut that didn't bleed. The woman, not hidden, not intimidated, stepped forward and placed her hand lightly on my shoulder. Not a grip, not a claim, not a performance. A touch that communicated something far more devastating than possession: certainty. It was the kind of touch people use when they don't need to defend their place. My wife's pupils widened, and she stumbled one emotional step backward. She saw what she never considered possible: a woman who didn't replace her desperation, only her role. There was no competition in the woman's gaze. No triumphant mirk, no silent brag. Just calm understanding, as though she recognized my wife for exactly what she was, someone from another chapter. My wife tried to gather herself, repositioning her shoulders like armor. She forced a laugh that cracked midway, attempting to shape the scene into something she could control. So, who is she? Her tone pretended curiosity, but her eyes begged for denial, that I would interrupt, soften the blow, rescue her dignity. She wanted me to say it was a misunderstanding, that the woman was a relative, a friend, a temporary presence. But I didn't. She's the reason I realized partnership doesn't suffocate, it strengthens. Her lips trembled. The lines she rehearsed in the car, about forgiveness, destiny, love rediscovered, collapsed under the weight of something she never met before: indifference. The woman beside me didn't tighten her hand or lean closer. She didn't need theatrics. My wife understood something far more devastating. She was no longer competing for affection. She was competing for relevance. Her gaze circled the room again, searching desperately for proof that she still mattered. An item she bought, a photo she posed in, a memory preserved. There was none. The house didn't look like she had been forgotten. It looked like she had never been necessary. Her throat tightened as she whispered, "So that's it." I nodded once. "No," the woman corrected gently. "That's what leaving looks like." My wife blinked like someone who had just woken up in a life she didn't recognize. Her confidence evaporated. Her script died. Her power dissolved. That was the moment she learned the most painful truth of adulthood. Some doors don't close on you. They simply stop opening. For years, my wife had mastered the art of emotional theatrics. She could turn guilt into a crown, sadness into a weapon, and regret into a stage performance worthy of applause. She entered our home expecting the same script to work, believing memories were strings she could tug to control me. She straightened her back, softened her voice, and let her eyes glisten with practiced sorrow. At first, she tried sentimentality. "I remember our first night here," she whispered, touching the wall as if emotion lived inside the paint. "The vows we made, the dreams we planned, you can't erase all that." She expected me to crumble at the mention of promises. She expected nostalgia to drag me back into her gravity. But the room didn't react. The woman beside me didn't look impressed. There were no tears, no soft gasps, not even a twitch. So my wife shifted tactics. She blamed circumstances, the stress of work, her confusion about marriage, her claim that she needed time to find herself, as if I were a temporary burden she carried reluctantly. She spoke with urgency, weaving tales of emotional exhaustion and spiritual searching. She thought responsibility was optional, that excuses were substitutes for loyalty. But accountability has a way of sniffing out lies. The other woman, who had been quiet until then, stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't adopt a superior tone. She simply watched my wife the way surgeons observe patients before making the first incision. Calm, calculated, unshaken. "You talk about vows," the woman said, "but vows don't vanish because life gets inconvenient." My wife's face tightened. She reached for another lifeline. "You don't understand. Marriage isn't easy." I was overwhelmed. The woman tilted her head, not mocking, not judging, merely clarifying. Overwhelm doesn't justify abandonment. Silence followed, sharp, uncomfortable, slicing through the room like a cold draft. My wife attempted one last maneuver. She touched her heart dramatically and let tears fall, believing sorrow would buy sympathy. "I was lost," she whispered. "I didn't know what I wanted." The woman finally delivered the question, the one that didn't merely challenge her behavior but exposed it. "If he was so important, why did you abandon him?" There was no malice in her tone.
No accusation.
Just reality, clean, surgical, unavoidable. My wife's expression froze. Her lips parted, but no explanation emerged. She blinked once, twice, as if waiting for words to magically form, words that could rewrite the past, excuse the damage, or repaint her decision as something noble. Nothing came. It was the first time I had ever seen her without a comeback. Not because she lacked the ability, but because the question didn't allow escape. The woman hadn't asked about feelings, circumstances, or intentions. She asked about action, the one thing my wife couldn't defend. Her silence wasn't just quiet, it was honest. It was the sound of truth landing.
The room shifted then.
Not physically, but emotionally. For the first time in our relationship's unraveling, my wife stood in a place she had never been before, without leverage. She looked smaller, not because anyone diminished her, but because reality no longer inflated her importance. Her tactics, tears, memory, guilt, had always served her like loyal soldiers. But soldiers are useless when the war has already ended. She wasn't fighting for love. She was fighting for relevance. And relevance is not something you demand. It is something you earn. In that moment, she learned a lesson adulthood rarely teaches gently. You cannot abandon someone then return expecting applause for showing up late to a life you willingly left behind. When a person leaves, you expect distance to blur details, memories to soften edges, and emotions to dissolve into something manageable. But in my case, her absence sharpened everything. I didn't go looking for answers. Answers found me. I didn't become a detective. I became a witness to truths she forgot the world could reveal. She stood in my living room that evening, wobbling between shock and indignation, grasping at narratives she believed were still intact. Her chin lifted, her shoulders stiffened, and she waited for an apology, for a confession of loneliness, for a plea to return. Instead, I walked past her, calm as a man who no longer carries weight that isn't his. "You left because you needed space," I began, my voice steady. But space wasn't a reason. It was the alibi. Before she could respond, I placed my phone on the coffee table, turned the screen toward her, and tapped the first image. It wasn't a message. It wasn't speculation. It was a bank transfer. Her bank transfer. A consistent pattern, small withdrawals first, then larger ones. Accounts linked to her name siphoning funds I never authorized. Dates matched perfectly with the weeks she claimed she was emotionally overwhelmed. She blinked rapidly, her hand twitching as if she could erase data by will alone. "That's not," she started. I lifted my hand, stopping her without raising my voice. "There's more." The next swipe revealed screenshots, conversations she had with her sister, her mother, even distant cousins who treated our marriage like a community debate. Lies written in plain language, painting me as cold, selfish, controlling. She wasn't confused about our relationship. She was constructing her exit, brick by brick, using distorted stories as mortar. She swallowed hard, her breath shallow.
Still, she tried to speak.
I never meant to. I moved to the final folder. Her face drained of color. Vacation photos. But not ours. There she was, smiling at sunsets she never shared with me. Beaches she claimed she couldn't afford because life was stressful. Restaurants she described as places I'd like us to visit someday. The damning detail wasn't her presence. It was the company. A man's reflection in her sunglasses. A hand intertwined with hers. 2 wine glasses in every toast she posted. Her space wasn't self-discovery, it was relocation. Each picture wasn't an accident. It was evidence, not of betrayal. That's too soft a word, but of replacement before departure. She didn't walk away searching for clarity. She walked away because she was already claimed elsewhere. My wife's lips trembled. Her fingers hovered above the screen, as though touching the images might distort reality. But reality was stubborn. It refused to rearrange itself for her comfort. She finally whispered, "Why didn't you ever ask me?" I met her eyes. "Because you didn't leave doubt. You left proof." There was no shouting.
No storm.
I didn't need theatrics. The silence in the room did the work. The myth she carefully sculpted of being misunderstood, mistreated, and suffocated cracked open and crumbled right at her feet. She had always believed she controlled narratives. That night, the narrative turned on her. She sat down, not because she was tired, but because the truth is heavy. Heavier than guilt, heavier than secrets, heavier than the ego she carried like armor. The new woman stood still, watching, not triumphant, not amused, simply present. Witness to accountability my wife had evaded for years. My wife didn't deny anything. She couldn't. The facts were airtight, the timeline undeniable. She had woven a fabric of lies so confidently she forgot fabrics burn. And in that quiet, unceremonious moment, something ended. Not our marriage, not our history, but the illusion she built around herself. The innocence she paraded like a shield disintegrated without a scream, without a tear, without a final plea. It didn't die dramatically. It simply ceased to exist. The weight of evidence settled over the room like dust in an abandoned house. She stood motionless, stripped of her narratives, her practiced excuses rendered useless. For a moment, she didn't speak. Her breathing slowed, her eyes darting between the woman beside me and the proof glowing on the screen like a silent judge. When she finally opened her mouth, her voice trembled, not with remorse, but with strategy. "I don't want people to misunderstand," she murmured, her tone rehearsed, not repentant. "We should fix this privately. Nobody needs to know what happened between us." There it was, not a plea for forgiveness, not a desire for reconnection, but a negotiation for reputation. She wasn't afraid of losing me. She was terrified of losing the image of herself she had curated so carefully, the devoted wife, the misunderstood victim, the martyr who bravely walked away. She didn't fear consequences. She feared witnesses. I watched her straighten her posture, pressing her palms together as if composing herself for a performance. The tears forming in her eyes didn't fall. They hovered, waiting to be deployed like weapons if the moment demanded pity. "We can tell people we're working things out," she continued. "That we needed time apart. Nobody has to know the details. It's better for both of us." Her voice softened, attempting to sound wise, mature, even protective. She spoke like someone offering a noble compromise. But every syllable revealed the truth. She wasn't asking for a second chance. She was asking for a shield. The woman beside me didn't move. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't smirk, didn't interrupt. She simply stood in stillness, as though observing a phenomenon rather than a person. My wife interpreted the silence as permission and stepped closer, lowering her voice in a tone she once used to get what she wanted. "You don't have to say everything. People don't need to know about him, about the photos. We can leave the past where it belongs." Her words were polished, but her panic leaked through the cracks. This wasn't humility. This was survival instinct. I looked at her carefully, studying the face I once trusted. She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry she was caught without a narrative that could save her. She had always believed perception was power, that as long as she managed the story, she owned the truth. But truth requires no permission. "You're not asking me to protect us," I finally replied. "You're asking me to protect you." Her lips parted, but no denial came. Silence has a peculiar honesty when lies lose their footing. I continued, calm, steady, unshaken. "You weren't afraid to walk away. You weren't afraid to lie. You weren't afraid to replace me. But now that the consequences exist outside your control, you want partnership." Her gaze faltered. She hadn't expected directness. She expected negotiation, emotional bargaining, a door half open for her to re-enter as a revised version of herself. "But think about my family," she whispered, desperation now visible. "About what they'll say. They'll never forgive me." And there it was, the confession hidden behind all her requests. She didn't want reconciliation. She wanted reputation management. Once upon a time, I would have shielded her. I would have softened the truth, swallowed my dignity, and rebuilt her facade with my own hands. But I finally understood something people rarely admit. Protecting someone who destroys you is not loyalty. It's self-betrayal. "I won't lie for you," I said quietly. "Not anymore." She stepped back as if struck, not by my tone, but by the realization that her last weapon had failed. She wasn't losing a husband. She was losing an alibi. I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice. I simply protected something she had never valued, my peace. Her request for secrecy still lingered in the air when I walked away from her, leaving her alone in the living room she no longer recognized. She believed she could negotiate history, rename betrayal, and reorganize the truth into something socially acceptable. She thought embarrassment was temporary and that time and silence were enough to restore her throne. But while she was crafting stories and curating sympathy, I was doing something she never imagined I was capable of. I was letting go. Not with rage.
Not with theatrics.
With preparation. While she spent months disappearing into someone else's arms, I spent mine in conversations she never suspected. Quiet meetings with attorneys, document reviews, financial audits, emotional inventory. My grief didn't break me. It structured me. Pain gave me clarity. Silence trained me to think. Loneliness taught me what partnership wasn't. She believed leaving me suspended my life. She was wrong. It rerouted it. So when she attempted to wrangle back her narrative, when she assumed her dramatic return would reset the marriage she abandoned, she miscalculated something fundamental. I had already rewritten my ending. By the time she stepped outside, divorce papers clenched in her trembling hands, the air around the house felt heavier. Not dramatic, observed. Curtains shifted. Silhouettes hovered. People who once greeted her with admiration now watched cautiously, unsure whether to pity or distance themselves. Reputations, she once believed, were shaped by charm. She never understood that reputations could also be shattered by consequences. When she first moved into this neighborhood years ago, she treated every gathering like an audition. She mastered smiles, flaunted our relationship like a trophy, made sure everyone noticed her rings, her bags, her carefully curated happiness. She believed admiration equaled power, and she invested heavily in appearances. That image had been her currency. But now, that same community saw her with new eyes sharpened not by hearsay, but by evidence. She attempted to walk with confidence toward her car, chin lifted as though dignity still lived in her posture. But her steps faltered. Every movement felt like a performance with no audience. The neighbors who once praised her wardrobe now stared not at her clothes, but at the envelope pressed to her chest, the envelope that proved her story had fractured. At the corner house, Mrs. Harrington, once her loyal listener, turned her back when my wife approached. The man who used to wave at her while jogging avoided even glancing her way. Parents who once applauded her for being such a strong woman now pulled their children closer, as though deceit were contagious. These weren't judgmental strangers. They were informed observers. She tried to muster a smile, the same smile she once polished like jewelry, but it cracked before it reached her cheeks. Without applause, she had no stage. Without admiration, she had no script. One of the neighbors, a quiet man who rarely interfered in anyone's business, finally broke the silence, not with words, but with action. He stepped aside when she approached the sidewalk, giving her a wide berth, as if her presence carried residue. It wasn't cruelty, it was recognition. People don't distance themselves from victims. They distance themselves from architects of their own chaos. She stopped walking for a moment, perhaps expecting anyone, to ask if she was all right, to offer comfort, to acknowledge her. No one did. For years, she thrived on attention. Now, she suffocated in its absence. When she reached her car, she fumbled with the keys. The door didn't open with grace. It jolted. She slammed it shut harder than necessary. Not out of anger, out of panic. She could feel truth pressing against the windows of her world, exposing everything she spent months trying to hide. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. The engine roared to life, but even that sound betrayed her. It wasn't the confident start of someone leaving triumphantly. It was the wounded cry of ego collapsing under its own weight. As she backed out of the driveway, her tires screeched, not because the road was slippery, but because control was gone. Her exit wasn't elegant. It was frantic. Her car sped down the street, yet the community didn't watch with curiosity. They watched with clarity. No one asked what happened. No one needed explanation. Truth had already done the speaking. She wasn't the woman returning to reclaim her place. She was the woman who returned only to discover she didn't have one anymore. And in that single drive away from the house she once ruled, she learned something she had spent her entire life avoiding. A crown is not something others place on your head. It is something you must earn. And once lost, it doesn't follow you. It stays where you left your integrity. There is a kind of silence that doesn't ache. Not the silence of waiting, not the silence of unfinished conversations, but a silence that feels earned, like a room finally cleared of furniture that once bruised your shins every time you walked through. That was the silence I woke up to in the days that followed her departure. Not a void, but a space. Not abandonment, but freedom. People often imagine healing as dramatic, public declarations, triumphant speeches, cutting ties with fireworks. But real healing is quieter. It happens when you stop rehearsing arguments in your head. When you stop checking who views your posts. When someone mentions her name and your pulse doesn't change rhythm. The world expects revenge to be loud. but some victories whisper. I didn't march through the neighborhood announcing what happened. I didn't post screenshots online, didn't gather sympathy like badges of honor, didn't weaponize her choices. I didn't need to. The truth had done its job, and truth never demands an encore. She wanted secrecy, but not accountability. She feared exposure more than remorse. But I wasn't interested in punishing her. I was interested in reclaiming myself. I began rebuilding, not by replacing her, but by rediscovering the pieces of myself I had shelved to maintain a marriage that functioned like a museum, curated, controlled, silent. I started cooking meals I enjoyed, not meals designed to impress. I rearranged furniture without seeking approval. I laughed, genuinely, unexpectedly, at jokes that once would have been dismissed as immature. Every small act was a thread stitching my life back together, not with the ambition of perfection, but with intention. The woman who stood beside me through the storm didn't try to own me. She didn't demand I forget the past or perform gratitude. She simply existed in honesty, which made her presence feel like fresh air, not perfume masking rot, but oxygen clearing smoke. We didn't rush into defining anything. There were no titles, no promises carved too early. Just two adults choosing presence over performance. Meanwhile, my former wife attempted to maintain her narrative. She made a few calls, tried to reclaim her dignity with phrases like misunderstanding and complicated emotions, hoping someone would volunteer empathy. But explanations crumble when actions contradict them. Each attempt to rewrite the past dissolved before it reached my doorstep. She knocked, not literally, but through messages, mutual acquaintances, hints that she was reflecting. She expected a reaction. She received none. Indifference is often mistaken for coldness. In reality, it is mastery over chaos. The day I realized I no longer needed closure was the day I understood peace. Peace wasn't her apology. Peace wasn't her understanding what she had done. Peace wasn't even forgiveness. It was absence of reaction. The fire she once ignited in me now had no oxygen. I didn't win her back. I didn't want to. I outgrew the version of myself who thought marriage was proven by endurance rather than compatibility. I outgrew the belief that love must be tolerated rather than reciprocated. I outgrew the emotional reflex that mistook persistence for loyalty. One afternoon, weeks later, I stood at the window with a cup of coffee, watching the world unfold at a pace that no longer frightened me. The tumult of the past didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a bridge I had crossed. Someone once told me that closure is when the story stops hurting. They were wrong. Closure is when the story stops mattering. My door remains open, not for her, not for explanations, but for life. The past knocked once more, timid and uninvited. I didn't answer. I no longer lived at that address.